The most decorated Vietnam War hero in Hollywood had never set foot in Vietnam. Robert Michael Curtiz sat behind his director's chair on Stage 12 at Warner Brothers Studios on a scorching August morning in 1973, wearing his customary military-style jacket, adorned with ribbons and patches that told the story of a combat veteran who had earned his stripes in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The cast and crew of Blood and Honor, his latest war epic, listened with rapt attention as he described the authentic details he was bringing to the film based on his personal experiences in combat. What they didn't know was that Robert Michael Curtiz had spent the Vietnam War in a comfortable office in Burbank, filing paperwork for a defense contractor and inventing increasingly elaborate stories about the heroic military service he had never actually performed. Dean Martin stood at the edge of the soundstage, watching Curtiz's performance with the cold attention of a man who recognized a con artist when he saw one. Dean had been hired to star in Blood and Honor against his better judgment, drawn by the promise of a serious dramatic role that would demonstrate his range beyond the Matt Helm spy comedies that had defined his recent career. But something about Curtiz's war stories had struck Dean as off, not because they were too dramatic or too heroic, but because they contained the kind of small, specific inaccuracies that only someone who had never been in combat would make. Dean Martin had never served in Vietnam himself, but he had friends who had, and he knew the difference between real war stories and Hollywood fantasies. Robert Michael Curtiz was a master of stolen valor, a man who had built his entire career on lies about military service he had never performed. He had started small, claiming to be a Vietnam veteran at parties and industry gatherings, adding details and decorations as his reputation grew and his stories became more elaborate. By 1973, he was directing major war films, consulting on military authenticity for other productions, and presenting himself as Hollywood's expert on the reality of combat in Southeast Asia. His fraud was so complete and so carefully constructed that even military advisors on film sets had been fooled by his detailed knowledge of equipment, tactics, and military culture that he had acquired through research rather than experience. The confrontation that would expose Curtiz's decade of deception began when he made the mistake of questioning Dean Martin's understanding of the material they were filming. "Dean, you're playing this scene too casually," Curtiz called out during a take where Dean's character was supposed to be discussing a combat mission with his fellow soldiers. "You don't understand the weight of what these men are carrying. You've never been in a situation where lives depend on your decisions." Dean stopped in the middle of his dialogue and looked directly at the director. "You're right, Bob. I've never been in combat, but I know people who have, and I've listened to their stories, real stories, not movie stories." Curtiz sensed something dangerous in Dean's tone, but his ego and his commitment to maintaining his fabricated identity drove him to double down on his criticism. "With respect, Dean, listening to stories isn't the same as living through the experience. I spent 18 months in the Central Highlands. I know what it feels like to lose men under your command. I know what it's like to make life and death decisions in the jungle." The soundstage went quiet. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something more than a creative disagreement between star and director. Dean's expression had changed from professional frustration to something much more serious and potentially dangerous. 18 months in the Central Highlands," Dean repeated slowly, as if he was memorizing the details. "What unit were you with, Bob?" Curtiz had rehearsed this part of his story countless times. "First Infantry Division, Bravo Company, under Colonel Marcus Thompson. We were doing long-range reconnaissance patrols, hunting down NVA supply routes." Dean nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. And this was what years? 1968 to 1970. Some of the heaviest fighting of the war." Dean lit a cigarette, a gesture that everyone on the set recognized as a sign that he was thinking carefully about something important. "Bob, can I ask you to do me a favor?" Curtiz was confident in his fabricated military background and curious about what Dean might be requesting. "Of course, Dean. What do you need?" "I'd like you to repeat that story tomorrow morning. Same details, same unit, same time frame, but I'd like you to tell it to some friends of mine who are visiting the set." Something cold settled in Curtiz's stomach, but he was committed to his deception and couldn't back down without raising suspicions. "I'd be happy to talk to your friends about my service. It's important that people understand what our boys went through over there." Dean's smile was gentle, but there was something predatory in his eyes. "Great. I'll make some phone calls tonight and see who's available." The next morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a Los Angeles summer day. Dean arrived on set earlier than usual, accompanied by 4 men who looked nothing like the typical Hollywood types who usually visited movie productions. These men were in their late 20s to early 30s, wore simple civilian clothes, and carried themselves with the distinctive posture of people who had learned to be constantly aware of their surroundings. They weren't imposing physically, but there was something in their eyes that suggested they had seen things that most people couldn't imagine. Robert Michael Curtiz was setting up for the morning shoot when Dean approached with his guests. "Bob, I'd like you to meet some friends of mine. This is Tommy Rodriguez, Mike Chaney, David Washington, and Jim Sullivan. They all served in Vietnam and are interested in hearing about your experiences over there." Curtiz extended his hand to each man, maintaining his confident persona despite the growing sense that something was wrong. These men didn't look like the civilians or military consultants who usually visited film sets to discuss technical accuracy. They looked like people who had been through something that had fundamentally changed them. "Gentlemen, it's an honor to meet you," Curtiz said, falling into the commanding tone he used when discussing his fabricated military service. "I always enjoy talking with fellow veterans about our shared experiences in Southeast Asia." Tommy Rodriguez, a compact man with intelligent eyes and visible scarring on his hands, was the first to respond. "What unit did you say you were with, sir?" Curtiz repeated his rehearsed story. "First Infantry Division, Bravo Company, Central Highlands, 1968 to 9." The 4 men exchanged glances that Curtiz didn't notice, but Dean caught immediately. Something in their expression suggested that Curtiz had just made a serious mistake. Mike Chaney, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, asked the next question. "Colonel Thompson, you said? Tall guy, scar on his left cheek, always carried a lucky penny in his breast pocket?" Curtiz felt the first flutter of real panic, but he committed to his story. "That's right, Marcus Thompson. Good man, tough commander. He kept us alive out there." David Washington, whose calm demeanor carried an undertone of contained anger, stepped forward. "Sir, I served under Colonel Marcus Thompson in the Central Highlands, Bravo Company, just like you said. The only problem is, Colonel Thompson was killed in action in April 1969, and Bravo Company was disbanded 2 months later. There was no Bravo Company doing long-range reconnaissance patrols in 1970. The silence that followed was suffocating. Curtiz felt the walls closing in around him, but he was so committed to his fabricated identity that he couldn't bring himself to confess. Instead, he tried to bluff his way through the confrontation. "There must be some confusion," Curtiz said, his voice beginning to show strain. "Memory can play tricks on you when you've been through combat situations. The details sometimes get mixed up." Jim Sullivan, who had been silent until now, spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to command respect through competence rather than bluster. "Sir, there's no confusion. I was Colonel Thompson's radio operator. I was with him when he died. You weren't there." The pretense that this was a friendly conversation between veterans evaporated completely. Curtiz found himself facing 4 men who knew, with absolute certainty, that he was lying about the most fundamental aspects of his claimed military service. Furthermore, Tommy Rodriguez continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "The First Infantry Division wasn't doing long-range reconnaissance patrols in the Central Highlands during that time period. That was Special Forces territory. If you'd actually been there, you'd know that." Curtiz was trapped in a lie that was collapsing around him, but his commitment to his fraudulent identity made him double down rather than confess. "Gentlemen, I don't appreciate having my service record questioned. I fought for this country, and I've earned the right to—" "You didn't fight for anything," Mike Chaney interrupted, his voice cutting through Curtiz's bluster like a blade. "You're a fake. You're stolen valor personified, and you've been using our sacrifices to build your career." The entire film crew had stopped working to watch the confrontation unfold. Everyone on the soundstage understood that they were witnessing something historic, the complete exposure of a fraud who had built his reputation on lies about military service. Dean Martin stood slightly apart from the group, smoking his cigarette, and watching Curtiz's humiliation with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully sprung a trap that had been months in the planning. He had suspected Curtiz's military stories were fabricated, but he had needed proof before acting on his suspicions. David Washington delivered the final blow. "Sir, I did 3 tours in Vietnam. I lost friends over there. Good men who died for something they believed in. And you've been using their sacrifice as a marketing tool for your movies. That's not just fraud, that's desecration." Curtiz's carefully constructed persona finally collapsed completely. His military bearing disappeared, replaced by the posture of a man who knew he had been caught in an indefensible lie. I can explain." "No," Dean said quietly, speaking for the first time since the introductions. "You can't explain, because there's no explanation for what you've done that makes it acceptable." Tommy Rodriguez stepped closer to Curtiz, his voice dropping to a level that only the director could hear. "We know what you really did during Vietnam. Defense contractor in Burbank, filing reports and shuffling papers while better men than you were dying in the jungle. You never left California, but you've been telling people you earned a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart." The specificity of the accusation hit Curtiz like a physical blow. Someone had done serious research into his actual background, and his entire fabricated military career was about to be exposed publicly. "How did you know?" Curtiz whispered. Dean answered the question. "Because when you started directing war movies, real veterans started paying attention to your stories, and real veterans can spot a fake from a mile away. All it took was a few phone calls to find out what you really did during the war." Jim Sullivan added the final devastating detail. "We've already contacted the Veterans Administration, the Department of Defense, and the media. Your fraud is about to become very public, very quickly." Curtiz looked around the soundstage at the faces staring back at him. Cast, crew, studio executives, all of whom now knew that his entire professional identity was built on lies. His career as a director was over, but more than that, his identity as a person was collapsing. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Curtiz said weakly. "I just wanted to make movies about the war, to honor the men who served." Mike Chaney's response was swift and brutal. "You didn't honor anyone. You dishonored everyone who actually served by pretending to be one of us. You turned our sacrifice into your profit." Dean stubbed out his cigarette and walked over to Curtiz. "Bob, here's what's going to happen. You're going to resign from this project immediately. You're going to issue a public apology admitting that you never served in Vietnam, and you're going to donate every penny you've made from war movies to veterans organizations." "And if I don't?" Curtiz asked, though he already knew the answer. David Washington answered for Dean. "Then we make sure every veteran organization in the country knows exactly who you are and what you've done. We make sure every studio in Hollywood knows they're hiring a fraud. We make sure your name becomes synonymous with stolen valor." The threat was devastating because it was completely credible. These men had the knowledge, the connections, and the moral authority to destroy Curtiz's career and reputation completely. Curtiz nodded in defeat. "I'll resign today. I'll issue a statement." "Good," Dean said. "And Bob, don't ever let me hear that you've tried to profit from military service you never performed again, because next time I won't be so gentle about exposing you." Robert Michael Curtiz left the Warner Brothers lot that afternoon and never returned. He issued a public statement admitting that he had never served in Vietnam and apologizing for misrepresenting his military background. The scandal destroyed his career in Hollywood, and he spent his remaining years working in industrial training films and educational videos, never again attempting to direct major motion pictures. Blood and Honor was completed under a new director, with Dean Martin staying on the project to ensure that the film portrayed military service with the authenticity and respect that Curtiz's version would never have achieved. The movie became a powerful and accurate depiction of combat in Vietnam, praised by veterans organizations for its realistic portrayal of the challenges faced by American soldiers. The 4 veterans who had exposed Curtiz became informal consultants to the film industry, helping ensure that future war movies were made with genuine respect for military service and accurate portrayals of combat experiences. Their work helped prevent other instances of stolen valor in Hollywood productions. Dean Martin's role in exposing Robert Curtiz became part of Hollywood legend, but it was never publicly discussed in detail. Those who knew about it understood that Dean had acted not out of personal animosity, but out of respect for the men who had actually served their country in combat. He had recognized that allowing Curtiz's fraud to continue would have been a betrayal of every veteran who had earned their service record through genuine sacrifice. The story served as a warning to others in the entertainment industry who might be tempted to fabricate military credentials for professional advantage. It demonstrated that stolen valor would not be tolerated, and that there were people watching who would hold fraudsters accountable for their deceptions. In a business built on illusion and performance, Dean Martin had drawn a clear line between acceptable fiction and unacceptable fraud. He had shown that some things, military service, combat experience, the sacrifice of veterans, were too sacred to be faked for professional gain. The fake war hero had been exposed, and the real heroes had been honored. In Dean Martin's world, that was exactly how it should be.